Well then, morning team. Yes, it's me, your favourite, Jordan at the screen. and today, and today, my darlings, I would like to talk to you about the prison sentencing gender gap. And a bit of a content warning, because I'm quite emotionally invested in this topic. I will get quite passionate. So if you don't like cuss words and you don't like expletives and cursing, now's your chance to fuck off. So yes, today's talk is born out of my video series and ever-growing list, Women Who Should Be in Prison. And I created this list series thing way back in August last year because I was often seeing these cases where women were committing what I, as a relatively sane and stable member of society, believed to be prison-worthy offences, yet these women were not being sentenced to immediate custody. And I would actually like to thank Mike right here, and Jonathan as well, for Mike's site and for the contributions I've received, and many others who've emailed in, as they have been like the source of inspiration and power that's kept the list going. And as these were always coming in, I was becoming more and more irate and had to start taking it from a list to activism, as you'll hear about, and I was becoming, as what the feminist left likes to say, an angry white male. And so in today's talk, I will give a brief outline of the current situation. I will discuss some of the issues that appear to arise in the courtroom, and I will look at how male psychology and offender life history needs to be properly addressed to assist those in the criminal justice system. And I will look at where the situation is going and what can be done in the meantime. So let's crack on. Oh, and I figured I would do it in pink because I like adhering to the traditional gender standards of colour. So, the lay of the land. As we know, men are the majority of the prison population. They are treated more harshly every step of the way. Alternatives to prison are offered more often to women than they are to men. Many myths surround the prison sex disparity, obfuscating the issue, and there are more similarities in terms of offending than there are differences. This is not an underground issue. This is quite well known by the members of public. And I won't spend too long on this because Philip Davies spoke wonderfully on this 2 years ago. But briefly, what is going on at the moment is, according to the Ministry of Justice statistics on women and the criminal justice system 2015, 4.5% of the prison population is female, compared to 95.5% male, which is 1 woman to 21.2 men. Men accounted for the majority of all arrests, 84% in 2015-16, 5.25 times as often. Men were 73% of prosecutions, convictions and sentences, 2.7 times as often, and for indictable offences, 15% of women sentenced received immediate custody, compared with 28% of men, an odds ratio of 1.87. So we can see the clear biases going on there. For all offences, only 2% of women sentenced received immediate custody, compared to 10% of men. So thus men are 5 times more likely to receive immediate custody. Women are less likely to re-offend, 18% versus 26%, which destroys this revolving door argument which we often hear from the left and people like the Centre for Social Justice, who argue that women get trapped in this revolving door. Less than 20% of women were serving up to 6 months, and about 35% are serving more than 4 years. For men, less than 10% were serving up to 6 months, and more than half are in for more than 4 years. The average custodial sentence length for all offences was 16.9 months for men and 9.5 months for women. Men's sentence length is 1.8 times as great. And lastly, for that source, the likelihood of being a victim of personal crime was less for women, 3.8% versus 4.5%, and women were less likely to be victims of violent crime in general, 1.3% versus 2.4%. In fact, the only form of violent crime in which women suffered the most was domestic, which is the least common form of violent crime, 0.4% versus 0.2%. And the biggest difference was in stranger violence at 0.4 and 1.4. And this destroys the argument, which we often hear in the press and from those who are trying to enact penal reform, saying that women need to be treated more leniently because they are victims of domestic violence, that they are simply trying to escape it. And this argument is employed by the all-party parliamentary group on women in the penal system and others. So it's nice to see that the government is looking at such a minutiae of a problem. According to the MOJ Association's Between Being Male or Female and Being Sentenced to Prison in England and Wales 2015 report, the odds of being male and being sentenced to imprisonment were higher than those of females. Well, no fucking shit. The effect was... I'm already beginning to get irritated, and I wrote the fucking thing. The effect was statistically significant and medium-sized, an 88% increase in the odds of imprisonment for males out of a total of 354,699 offenders, so not a triflingly small population sample. 8% of female defendants were imprisoned when sentenced for their first main offence, compared to 18% for men, which is one of the myths that runs around, that women are sentenced more likely for their first offence. The analysis found small increases of 35% in the odds of imprisonment for males within shoplifting or theft, non-motor, but large increases of 267% for violence against the person and public order and harassment offences, and 362% for drug import, export and production offences. In fact, the most common offence for defendants to be sentenced for as their first main offence was violence against the person, representing 22% for men and for women. For women, this is joint first with theft. And if anyone who saw that disastrous performance I gave on the big questions, where I was just quiet and did fuck all, you might remember that ugly bitch, the crime commissioner for North Yorkshire and the Centre for Social Justice woman, how they're like, oh no, but women, the majority of them are in there for non-violent offences. Well, same with men. Stop being a sexist. Treat them both the same. 68% of women and 80% of men had one or more prior convictions or cautions. 82% of women and 65% of men received a fine. And as shown in Table 1, which I've helpfully not included in the slideshow, the offences that men and women are perpetrating are actually roughly similar for their first main offence. That is, they are perpetrating in near identical rates similar crimes. And I'll give you the largest differences to show what they are. So it's theft non-motor, which is 22% female and 10% male, so only 12 percentage point difference. Drug possession supply, 5% versus 10%, so again another 5 percentage point difference. And drink driving, which is 15% versus 12% for female and male respectively. All the other differences are of 2 percentage points or less. So essentially the criminal behaviours of men and women are largely similar, and yet they're being treated largely differently when they go through the courts. And lastly, this one really tickled me, because you hear a lot in the press about personal characteristics affecting how you're treated in the criminal justice system. So let me tell you about this. Being identified as black and minority ethnic was associated with a 49% increase in the odds of imprisonment compared to being white. Being identified as male was associated with the 89% increase in the odds of imprisonment compared to being female. So thus a person's sex has a greater effect on their imprisonment than does their race, with an odds ratio of 1.82. Yet we hear all the time in the press about how race affects imprisonment, but very rarely about how sex affects imprisonment. So some examples. Thank you. So some examples, and this is where I'm going to start to get angry and probably chuck my glasses off and storm off for a bit. This is why it takes so bloody long for me to make the videos, because I read about them and I have to take a long time away just to come back to reality. But on the left is Charlie Alliston. I lost my laser pointer, so I can't point him out, but I'm sure you know your left from right. Charlie Alliston, who in September last year was sentenced to 18 months in a young offender institution for his part in the tragic accident that took the life of Kim Briggs. He was riding a fixed-gear bike with no front brake at 20 miles an hour through London when Mrs. Briggs stepped into the road some 6.5 metres in front of him. By the time they collided, he was travelling at around 14 miles an hour, and due to the short distance, he had less than a second to react. And the highway code states a stopping distance of 12 metres when travelling at 20 miles an hour. She fell down and hit her head, sending her to hospital where she died a week later. Upon hearing of her death, Mr. Alliston made an attempt on his own life, and he spent 9 days in Maudsley Psychiatric Hospital, south of London, having been taken there by police who had found him out alone with a rope. In light of his attempt, consider what Judge Wendy Joseph QC said when sentencing him. You have throughout sought to put your blame on her. Perhaps one of the most shocking things about this case is that you could not, and apparently cannot, still see any fault in your cycling or judgment. Well, I'm sorry, bitch, but he tried killing himself. There's where he's accepting the blame. I won't read out the rest of the quote because I'm getting pissed off already. But let's move on to the next one. Jessica Wells in the middle. In March of last year, Jessica Wells struck and killed 80-year-old Ian Rose as he was alighting off a bus. She was travelling at 44 miles an hour in a 30-mile zone, and had just overtaken a lorry and undertaken a learner driver. So in short, Jessica Wells did travel 14 miles an hour over the speed limit and attempted to undertake a parked bus as passengers were alighting, only to collide with one, killing him. Yet when sentencing her, Judge Phillips Katz QC said, "You are also very conscious of the fact you have taken somebody's life, a fact you will have to live with for the rest of your life. I accept wholly that you are thoroughly remorseful about what you have done. It seems to me I will cause more damage than justice requires if I sentence you to prison." And she received 4 months that were suspended for 18 months. And that is right. That is similar cases, similar outcomes, which is death, and yet different sentences. And one could, in a sense, argue that the Jessica Wells case is worse because she was speeding and outright breaking the law, and so was Charlie Alliston, even though he believed he was okay because he had a fixed gear system which did act as a brake. But what irritated me really the most about this was that the Jessica Wells case, she was sentenced only the month before Charlie Alliston. So it's not like they happened miles apart. And his case broke the news and caused national outcry on how the law needs to be changed. Yet hers, just under the radar, just gone. Now this last one, I put in for all the fathers' rights activists in the room. Something for them to juxtapose their lived experience with. And so speaking of, we all know how easily spurious and frivolous allegations can result in a father not seeing his children for years. Just, oh, he slapped me one time 10 years ago when we were arguing. That's right, you're a danger to the kids, never see them again. Too many of us know that. So keep that in mind when hearing of this case. Tanya Clarence from New Malden, southwest London, smothered daughter Olivia 4 and 3-year-old twins Ben and Max because they were disabled. She was seen by 60 different professionals. Tanya Clarence was overwhelmed with having to care for her children who all suffered from the muscle-weakening condition spinal muscular atrophy type 2, a serious inherited neuromuscular condition that can shorten life expectancy. However, Tanya waited until her husband was away in South Africa to kill her children. She then attempted a suicide, so this was a premeditated planned attack and killing. She was allowed home just 13 months after having killed 3 of her 4 children. She was then also allowed contact with the 4th child, and she wasn't even sentenced to prison, only to the short hospital order. Allowed home on weekends and contact with the remaining surviving daughter, after having killed 75% of her children, and there are dads in this room who've not seen their kids in fucking years, just because of a lie told in a court. The bloody hypocrisy and double standards. That gets to me. And she was granted a hospital order rather than prison due to mental health, her illness, stress, feeling overwhelmed, and low self-esteem. According to the sentencing remarks, her personality characteristics both made her more susceptible to develop a major depressive disorder and prevented the full extent of the disorder being recognized by others, and that it is a feature of her depression that she consistently minimized symptoms both before and since the fatal events. In the result, she suffered the major depressive episode to which has already been referred, in consequence of which she perceived that the situation could only get progressively worse and that there was little she could do about it. So that's right, presenting with few symptoms of depression is itself a symptom of depression. I present with very few symptoms of being a paraplegic, therefore I'm a fucking paraplegic. I can't imagine getting my disabled blue parking badge anytime soon. And the report said in July of 2013 that a consideration was given to involving the police, but according to the social care records, St. George's Hospital did not think that would be helpful. Wow. It also said that the concerns during this period, in the view of the authors, reached the threshold for child protection intervention, but this did not happen, despite references to legal intervention, and we shall hear some more about thresholds passing, yet not being considered a little later on. So custody threshold and aggravating versus mitigating factors. Statutory versus non-statutory. How is a factor decided as aggravating or mitigating? Do judges actually know the difference? Horrendous cases occur whereby factors are incorrectly considered, and custody threshold seems to mean nothing in some cases. So a court is required to pass a sentence that is commensurate with the seriousness of the offence, and the seriousness of an offence is determined by the culpability of the offender and the harm caused or risked being caused by the offence. Section 143, subsection 1 of the Criminal Justice Act 2003 provides In considering the seriousness of any offence, the court must consider the offender's culpability in committing the offence and any harm which the offence caused, was intended to cause, or might have foreseeably caused. And this is where we enter the aggravating and mitigating factors, which, as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, mitigating factors are more often given to women than to men. But let's analyse them a little bit. So according to the Sentencing Council, aggravating factors are split into factors indicating higher culpability and factors indicating a more than usually serious degree of harm. Mitigating factors are split into factors indicating lower culpability and offender mitigation. I would list them all, but we'll be here for literally ever. They go on for miles. So I'll briefly mention a few, starting with the only statutory factors, and these only apply to factors indicating higher culpability. So an offence committed whilst on bail for other offences, and the offence was racially or religiously aggravated. All the rest are non-statutory factors. And the custody threshold, for those who haven't figured out from its name, means the threshold at which immediate custody should be sentenced. And so considering all this, there are a few cases where judges have been a little confused by what constitutes an aggravating and a mitigating factor. And so thus ardent followers of my blog and subsequent series or list thing will be aware of quite a few of these cases I'm going to go through already. So Lauren Fowler, who 25 years old, she did in 2 separate incidents crash her car whilst driving under the excessive influence of alcohol. The first incident, which occurred in October 2017, did involve her drinking when out at lunch with friends and concluded with her buying and drinking to the base a bottle of wine, which was found in her car when she crashed it in an area busy with pedestrians. 2 months later, whilst on bail for the first offence, she did drink a half bottle of vodka before going to the gym, as you do. Pump yourself full of, calories and then go off to the gym. Great idea. But that's when she crashed her vehicle into another car when trying to exit the Stanleylands Hotel in Wilmslow, Cheshire. So to reiterate, at the time of this second collision, she was on bail for the first offence, and tests showed that she was over 3 times the drink-drive limit. And Fowler, a first-year doctor, broke down and wept in court as she was told her offending crossed the custody threshold. Let me just scrub down my notes. So according to the Sentencing Council, as Dr. Fowler was more than 3 times over the drink-drive limit, the starting point is 12 weeks custody, and the range is a high-level community order to 26 weeks custody and a disqualification of 29 to 36 months, and we extend that if imposing immediate custody. But if it is the second offence in 10 years, it's a 36 to 60 months disqualification. The aggravating factors in this case are... Oh, what's that pop-up? Go away. Aggravating factors are offence committed whilst on bail for other offences, which is a statutory factor, and the commission of an offence whilst under the influence of alcohol or drugs. And to repeat, the custody threshold had been passed. So what was her sentence? 8 weeks jail, suspended for a year, in order to complete 40 hours unpaid work, banned from driving for 3 years, and ordered to pay £200 court costs. Justice of the Peace Martin Drake told her, "We have considered all the facts of this case, and there are aggravating features. The first offence was committed during the day when there were pedestrians around, and the second offence was committed on bail, and it was a very high reading. This does cross the custody threshold, but the sentence will be suspended, and this means you will not be going to prison today. However, if you commit any offence during the next 12 months, another judge has the right to activate that sentence and can send you to custody." Forgive me, but you had the fucking right to activate that sentence. And not to spoil the ending, but this future judge totally fucking won't activate it. And to think the government is really hot at the moment on drink driving offences. It's all over their website. They really are trying to get offenders behind bars for it. And yet judges like this wanker doesn't bother. And I did actually have a second case, Karen Eastwood, who's also on my list. But when I did a practice run of this talk 2 nights ago, it lasted for 1 hour and 20 minutes, so I had to cut it out. But long and short is, she basically did the same thing. Went out drinking, got arrested because she crashed a car. A couple of months later, went out drinking, crashed a car again. And the judge was like, "You didn't mean it, you were sorry. I'll let you go." Now for another case where a judge was confused about mitigating and aggravating factors and whether they're applicable or not. So Karolina Sumko, 18, from Poland, did hurl a racially abusive tirade at bouncers because they rejected her from a club because she was too drunk. When arrested, she continued her abuse, but it aimed at offers and became more violent as well, spitting at them and hitting them. The violence continued into the police station. Now, such quotes of hers are, please mainstream media don't take these out of context, but such quotes of hers are, and fingers in ears if you are sensitive, she said, "You fucking black. You shouldn't be standing between us. You are going to fucking die, fucking racists. Pretend to be white but wish Merry Christmas to Muslim people." It goes on, I won't read it all out. But it's bloody horrid. So let's look at the statutory factors. Well, the factors indicating higher culpability, the offence was racially or religiously aggravated. Other non-statutory factors, factors indicating higher culpability, an intention to commit more serious harm than actually resulted from the offence was motivated by hostility towards a minority group or a member or members of it, deliberate targeting of vulnerable victims, commission of an offence whilst under the influence of alcohol or drugs, and then factors indicating a more than usually serious degree of harm, multiple victims, a sustained assault or repeated assaults on the same victim, and the offence is committed against those working in the public sector or providing a service to the public. The judge remarked, "I dare say you were not aware of what was going on." That's what drink does to you. And I accept what happened wouldn't have happened apart from drinking. You are genuinely sorry. This is the icing on the cake. I'm not going to send a lady to prison for something like this. Didn't even get a suspended sentence, 150 hours community service and £200 victim surcharge. I could then go on to remark on Lavinia Woodward, the girl too pretty to go to jail, but then again, not enough fucking time. Mental health and the revolving door of crime. Women are less likely to reoffend, 18% versus 26%. The argument of women as victims lacks justification. The gender empathy gap. Men are seen as criminals and women as victims. Past abuse is considered for female offenders, but not for male. Evidence shows abuse and maltreatment does not increase chances of future violence more for women than for men, so gender doesn't affect it. No requirement for prison-based services to be trauma-informed. Men come out without adequate rehabilitation and can leave in a worse state than how they entered. And male mental health needs are not met, even before entering the door of crime. So stories in lefty rags often state that women get trapped in this revolving door of crime, as I alluded to earlier. They suffer short sentences, are torn from their kids, lose their housing, come back out topside, and resort back to crime, only to return to prison. Now, I will not refute that this happens. However, do not be fooled into thinking this is a gendered problem that inherently affects women. As prior mentioned, it is men who reoffend more and are more likely to be caught in this revolving door of crime. And that's the same with the women as victims narrative. I don't refute that many of the women involved in the British justice system have suffered past abuse. I'm happy to accept it. What I do take a stand against is the male gender blindness, the complete blanking of male life history. Consider what Conservative MP Philip Lee had to say in The Guardian at the end of last month. Yes, I did just say that. I was going to say something slightly else, but I realised the C word might go down a bit the wrong way. On visit to women's prisons up and down the country, I was struck by how most of the women who get caught up in our criminal justice system are among the poorest and most vulnerable. Just look at the figures. 57% of women in prison have suffered domestic abuse, 49% report needing help for mental health problems, 48% said they had committed their offence to support someone else's drug use, and 24 to 31% have dependent children. I don't understand how 7% might be an if they have dependent children, either you have children or not. Now, I will not refute those figures, but in stereotypically MRA fashion, I am compelled to ask, but what about the men? Dr. Naomi Murphy from the FENS Offender Personality Disorder Pathway Service at HMP Whitemore, who spoke at the Male Psychology Conferences 2017 and 18, has been doing some wonderful work with male offenders. And she found of the people in her care, after 6 months with her, that they were willing to confess these to her, that 66.1% reported childhood sexual abuse, 72.6% reported childhood physical abuse, 80.6% reported childhood neglect, 66.1% reported childhood emotional abuse, 59.7% reported parental antipathy, 43.5% reported parental domestic violence, and 54% of the men who were sexually victimized as children were victimized by a woman. So this women as victims narrative utterly ignores all these men and their lived experiences. They're just wiped out. It's typical male gender blindness. And in fact, Tepitsis et al. 2012, in a longitudinal study of 1,539 low-income minority participants born in 79-80 in Chicago, so yes, US data, But they found that child maltreatment, ages 0 to 11, significantly predicted all indicators of violence, and in no instance did gender moderate the Maltreatment Violence Association. So again, the argument of women as victims completely ignores the stark reality that both men and women are victims. And now consider this British Psychological Society quote on male mental health needs. The way that men and women articulate and express mental and emotional distress is different. In particular, men are more likely to externalize their feelings, whereas women are more likely to present with anxiety or depression. Data show that men are more likely to turn to substance abuse, aggressive behavior, violence, and suicide, Wilkins 2010. Such men are thus more likely to be directed towards punitive interventions, where their behavioral needs may take precedent over their emotional distress. A recent paper describes how differences in the way men express depression lead to a substantial proportion of cases being missed by traditional diagnostic criteria, Martin et al. 2013. Fear that their distress might be misunderstood and lead to punitive interventions might also therefore make men reluctant to seek help. I've got to ask, how many men are in prison when instead they should have been given help for mental health? I don't know. How many men have suffered adverse mental health, or for a better term, mental distress, and have acted out, only to be sent to prison? How many men have suffered mental distress because they lost their kids because of the family courts, lost their jobs or are feeling suicidal, and in acts of desperation and loss of control, find themselves involved with the police and justice system and banged up because they are a bad man, when really they just need help? I don't really know. We can speculate, but we just don't know. And I also thought about what Darren said the other day, how men are charged, they're electric, and need to be able to discharge. And I think that's absolutely bloody right. But nobody seems to want to be willing to let them discharge. So keep all that what I just said in mind for a little later on. Traumatic brain injury. Traumatic brain injury is the biggest cause of death and disability in children and young people. TBI compromises important neurological functions for self-regulation and social behaviour, and increases risk of behavioural disorder and psychiatric morbidity. I'm aware that time is getting on. Is it okay if I just skip over that and you read it and I just count off my notes? Yeah, cool. So did I hear a no? I will send you out. Don't think I won't come up there. So a comprehensive review in the Lancet Psychiatry suggests that bumps to the head from falls, assaults, or road accidents, things that guys suffer from more than women, can lead to neural injuries which affect how the brain operates and may increase the risk of violent offending. They show how many people in the criminal justice system have had a traumatic brain injury. Around 20% have had a moderate to serious traumatic brain injury, with another 30 to 40% having had something less serious, thus meaning at least half of the prison population, around 40,000 people, have suffered a traumatic brain injury. And you can compare this to the 1 in 200 in the general public, and we see a vast discrepancy. Lead author Professor Hugh Williams of the University of Exeter said, "Addressing traumatic brain injury offers a means to not only improve the lives of those who offend, but also to reduce crime. A range of measures could reduce the risk of crime following traumatic brain injury. These could include any form of neurorehabilitation and better links between emergency departments, community mental health services, GPs and school systems that might lead to early identification and management." So imagine that. If their head injuries had been properly addressed by the criminal justice system and the health systems, up to and beyond perhaps 40,000 men could either be free or not in prison, could be receiving medical treatment instead, and could have prevented some sort of criminal behaviour or diverted them away from the criminal justice system. Andy Bell, Deputy Chief Executive from the Centre for Mental Health, said, "Identifying those who have emotional or cognitive difficulties resulting from a brain injury may help to ensure they get the right support to improve their mental health and potentially reduce their risk of later offending." Now, considering that over a quarter of male offenders re-offend, which is around 20,000 men, they could be diverted away from the criminal justice system if instead they received adequate care for their injury. Medical versus justice. Short-term orders, as per Section 136 of the Mental Health Act 1983, allow for the removal of a person from a public place by a police constable and for the person to be brought to a place of safety. So yes, short-term orders. As Figure 3.1 shows, the numbers brought to hospital have risen over the last 10 years from 5,495 in 2005 and 6 to 22,965 in 2015-16, an increase of 17,470, which is 318% over the 10-year period. In 2015-16, women were 16% of arrests, but approximately 45% of those taken to hospital. Allow me to repeat that BPS quote from a few slides back. The way that men and women articulate and express mental and emotional distress is different. In particular, men are more likely to externalize their feelings, whereas women are more likely to present with anxiety or depression. Data show that men are more likely to turn to substance abuse, aggressive behavior, violence, and suicide. Wilkins, 2010. Such men are thus more likely to be directed towards punitive interventions where their behavioral needs may take precedent over their emotional distress. So let's hear that again. In 2015-16, women were 16% of arrests, but approximately 45% of those taken to hospital. How many men have been put into the criminal justice system when all they needed was help? It would appear that the police, when dealing with men, predominantly see the act, yet when dealing with women, predominantly see the person. This has to change. I'm not done. I've got more slides. I do thank you for the applause. I just thought you were praising that quote. I was like, oh, stop it. I've got nearly 10 more minutes. Yes. But thank you. No, I just take it for the quote, because that was really good, that one. Anyone from the press in here, you can quote me. So what next? What next? The female offender strategy. I love this quote. The evidence shows us that vulnerability is not just a consequence of crime. It can also drive offending behavior and prevent people from breaking out of a cycle of reoffending. This is particularly stark when we look at female offenders. We know that there is a higher prevalence of need amongst female offenders, such as mental health problems and self-harm. I am convinced that if we take the right approach to female offenders, one that addresses vulnerability, follows the evidence about what works in supporting them to turn their lives around, and treats them as individuals of value, it could have substantial benefits for victims, families, and wider society, as well as for female offenders themselves. And that's from the Right Honourable David Gauke MP, who is the Secretary of State for Justice. Ignoring the blatant gynocentrism, not just in that quote, but also in the report, its recommendations are actually quite all right. Let's bring these up. So what does the government want to do? Well, as you can see, the main recommendations are to invest $5 million in community provisions for offenders who have suffered domestic abuse, to pilot residential centres to divert offenders to, rather than sending them to prison for short sentences, reduce the number of offenders serving short sentences, and the police are to refer to offenders to support rather than punitive measures, and to address the needs of offenders. And as I said, these are good recommendations. We like these ideas. The only problem is they only apply to women and not men. In fact, what they want to do with men, as was mentioned already, is to increase the population by 10,000. So yes, heavy amounts of gynocentrism. As was mentioned in regards to the first point, 66.1% reported childhood sexual abuse. Dr. Murphy's stats again, 72% reported childhood physical abuse. I mean, I don't need to go through them. Basically, a mean average of 65% of the prison population have suffered some form of abuse or other. That's just shy of 52,000 men, if we were to extrapolate Dr. Murphy's findings to the wider prison population. 52,000 men. Also, let's hark back to the second slide, that the likelihood of being a victim of personal crime was less for women, and that women were less likely to be victims of violent crime in general. We need to consider that men are also the victims of violent crime. And they literally pick the least common form of violence as the reason for letting women go. It's just staggering. It truly is staggering. And for points 2 and 3, to pilot these residential centres, they should be doing this for men. If they were to send men to these centres rather than to prison for short sentences, then less than 10% of male offenders are in for 6 months. That's 8,000 men. That's double the female prison population. The police are to refer offenders to support rather than punitive measures. In 2015-16, there were 900,000 arrests, of which 16% were female, 144,000. In the same year, approximately 45% of those taken to hospital under the short-term orders were women. So how many men could be diverted away from prison if they went to hospital instead? If they would actually apply this to men? And considering around 60% of the male prisoners had suffered a traumatic brain injury and another 65% have some form of abuse, if men were to be offered these diversions away from punitive measures, in other words, if men were to be treated like how women are soon to be treated, then at least 3 in 5 men in prison shouldn't be there. 3 in 5 men. Now my mouse isn't working. Come on, behave. There we go. And to address the needs of offenders, well, as we said, 65% of them have suffered abuse and 60% of them traumatic brain injury. All in all, we can only speculate at that 3 in 5. Sorry if I'm repeating myself, but it boils in my head that our government, with their own data, are blind to it. They're blind to their own data. They're blind to what they're finding and are just pushing this senseless ideology in order to demonize men. Combating improper rulings. I'm going to have to fly through this one. I've only got 5 minutes left. So I would like to tell you briefly how, in my ham-fisted and brutally amateurish manner, to appeal sentences and do what I can to combat improper rulings. There's the unduly lenient sentencing scheme, which basically means you can write to the Attorney General's office and ask for a hearing to be reviewed if you think it was too soft. And these apply to sentences passed in the Crown Court for indictable-only offences, or those passed in the Crown Court for specified either-way offences, or specified either-way offences for a sentence by a magistrate's court. And my biggest obstacle for this was the specified either-way offences, as I will show now. So remember the case that Ian spoke about yesterday, Charlotte Laudert, who stabbed her boyfriend in the face 8 times while screaming, "You are going to die tonight," and he had to wrestle the scissors out of her hands and dived out the window and broke both his feet when he landed. Well, I appealed that case when I heard about it. I was fucking disgusted. How can someone, a Women's Aid campaign champion, who's stabbing her partner in the face, get let off from prison? What's it? Judge Jane Sullivan ordered Laudat to pay £5,000 compensation, as well as $1,800 in court costs, and ordered a restraining order. She was also ordered to complete a community order of 14 days and another 30 days of rehabilitative activities. So no prison. None. And so when I submitted it in for review, it was denied on the grounds that, quote, sentenced for 2 offences contrary to Section 20 of the Offences Against a Person Act 1861. That offence does not qualify for referral to the Court of Appeal because it is not a specified offence for the purposes of Part 4 of the Criminal Justice Act 1988. So yeah, Section 20 is an either-way offence. Section 18 is an indictable-only offence, and they're relatively the same thing, and to cause grievous bodily harm. The only difference being between 18 and 20 is that with 18, it's with intent. Now, for some bizarre reason, the judge and the police and everyone involved in this case couldn't seem to find any fucking intent when she was stabbing her boyfriend in the face 8 times, yelling, "You are going to die tonight!" You can imagine my fury when I got that letter back from the Attorney General's office saying it was because it's Section 20, not Section 18. That's also the same reason that Lavinia Woodward's case could not be appealed, because when she stabbed her boyfriend in the leg, threw a laptop at him in a glass jam jar, and had choked out a previous boyfriend to the point of unconsciousness, and it was coked up and continued with the violence, they couldn't find any intent. I'm getting angry again. I'm going to have to stop. You can also order sentencing remarks if the judge says something fucking stupid and you want to know why. However, they're not very quick, so if you want to order sentencing remarks before doing the unduly lenient sentencing scheme, you'll have to be quick, because there's a 28-day time limit on the unduly lenient sentencing scheme. There's also the 56-day slip rule, which means that the Crown Court has the power to alter a sentence or any other order made by the Crown Court within 56 days from which it was made, the usual reason being that altering the sentence is that further information relevant to the sentence has become available to the court. So if ever you see one of these women who've committed domestic violence come out and they seem to be like, "Yeah, I got away with it," you can then have that sent back in. Unfortunately, all the cases I found relevant for that had passed the 56 days. Social media and blogging, please bring as much attention to these cases as possible. I've been doing it in my limited fashion through the backbencher, through my blog and my site. Anything to get the people pissed off and active, I'll be greatly appreciative. And then contacting your MP. So yeah, my recommendations and next best actions. Final slide, Mike, I can see you looking at your watch. Judges and courts to consider the life histories and mental health and distress of all offenders. An understanding of male psychology and behaviour, and to expand the unduly lenient sentencing scheme to include more offences. What you can do is to write to your MP, write to the Right Dishonourable David Gork MP, and to utilise the unduly lenient sentencing scheme and 56-day slip rule. Ultimately, I just want equal and fair treatment in the criminal justice system. So I will be uploading documents soon onto my site, how to do these things, how to get in contact with me. Please do check out my site and email me for more. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Jordan. Just a quick question then. Your issue about mental health in boys and all that kind of thing, and then also understanding male psychology and their behaviour. Are there any support programs out there for teenagers or for young boys who can then go and discuss their mental issues instead of, resorting to violence and fighting in pubs and that kind of thing?
Yeah, there's a lot of different men's groups that work for that. There's Journeyman and a Band of Brothers, who are both at the Male Psychology Conference, who do some phenomenal work with young boys, do like mentoring and taking them away on basically like weekends away, so that they can get to know these older men, learn how to be a man, learn how to fix their behaviours and to talk about what's going on. Because so many of these boys, they've gone through horrendous abuse and no one's ever given a shit. And they get taken on these weekends with guys who've been through it already and who sit them down and build up trust with them and actually listen to them. And it's amazing. I remember seeing the videos and these boys just couldn't actually believe that there are people in this world who care about them. And if we've got these boys growing up who are being abused and pushed around and treated like garbage and are told you have no value, are we honestly surprised that they then turn around and behave like this? So yeah, there are these groups. But yeah, Journeyman and a Band of Brothers, I would recommend checking them out.
Yeah, thanks for your wonderful statistics analysis, Jordan. Just to add a couple of points, which I'm sure you're aware of. Community sentences for men and women are treated differently. Community sentence for a man is normally hard labour, digging ditches or whatever, clearing drains. For a woman, it's working in a charity shop. Obviously, the discrimination sentencing is well known. I've got numerous examples from my own personal experience. One of the best was we were doing a court case for custody, and we were acting for the father. The mother's mother and the mother's sister were our witnesses, supporting custody for the father. And at the end of the 3-day trial, the judge, in summing up, said, "The father and his witnesses paint such a black picture of this woman that I do not believe it." But thank you, Jordan, anyway.
And I think we'll wrap it up there. Jordan, thank you very much.
Please don't run away. If you could all stick around for just a moment. Don't leave just yet.